Good morning. I welcome you to this panel on race reconciliation, public memory, and public memory papers in conversation with James Cone. I'm Gary Selby, and I teach at Emmanuel Christian Seminary, and I welcome all of you. I welcome our panelists. I'll introduce them in a moment. But I also want to add my voice to the chorus welcoming Professor James Cone. Charles A. Briggs, Distinguished Professor of Systematic Theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. We are honored that you are here with us at the Christian Scholars Conference. Not only as one of our plenary presenters, but also as a respondent to not one, but two different panels. So you have so honored us with your presence. I'll read the description of the panel's overarching theme. James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, written to promote healing for the wounds of racial justice that continue to divide our churches and our society, presents a powerful call to remember slavery, segregation, and the lynching tree. To forget these atrocities leaves us with a fraudulent perspective of this society and of the meaning of the Christian gospel for this nation. His work suggests that the future of race relations hinges on the way we remember. The papers on this panel explore dimensions of race and public memory in conversation with Cone's call to remember. We have three papers. First will be Christopher Dowdy from Paul Quinn College, presenting on a history of burnings, Ida B. Wells' white supremacy, and horror's place among the moral emotions. And then I'll present on All Lives Matter, Frederick Douglass and the challenge of moral blindness. And then Tanya Smith-Bryce from Benedict College will present on Called Out of Darkness, Church Memory in Black and White. The presenters will each take about 15 minutes, and we told Professor Cone, take as long as you want.
I'm not frequently mic'd, so this is very exciting. I'm going to be a part of. I'm going to stand up to give myself the illusion of authority. That's okay. Let me say a word of thanks to Gary and to David Fleer for helping to pull these particular pieces of the conference together, and to Tanya for the years of work she's put into the civil rights section and the team that's done that. This has been a really wonderful part of the conference for the past few years, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. This conference has been important to me for a long time, so it's nice to be back and be back in Nashville. So come on in, it's cool, it's fine. Okay. I also want to say a specific thank you to Professor Cone for being with us, and my voice to that. And also on another personal note, I happened to be at his Ingersoll lecture at Harvard like longer ago than I want to admit, for both of us probably, but and it was standing room only. I was sitting on the floor listening to this thing, and it pushed me in absolutely the right direction. And the material in that lecture is part of what became the material in the book and that he discussed with us last night. Please come here. So it was a remarkable experience for me, and a really important one for somebody coming out of the lovely and important institution of Abilene Christian all the way up to fancy town in Boston and being at Harvard for a little bit. And the direction that moved me was really important, and I'm grateful for it. One of the things that Professor Cone said in that back and forth, the question and answer session, was that he'd been convinced, I'm going to butcher this, so forgive me, but he'd been convinced for some time that good theology makes white people mad. So he came to Harvard to test it out. So good. And, this is like, it was perfect. It was perfect. So anyway, I'm doing the same thing this morning as best I can. So we'll see how funny you think I am at the end. Who knows? Okay, so I want to be a little informal this morning, if that's okay with you. If I'm lucky, it means I get done more quickly, and we can sort of make room for the other folks. If I'm as long-winded as I usually am, then we're all out of luck. So but I'll try. So I just want to do a couple things. I want to talk about sort of the framing of the essay I ended up writing, which is much different than the essay I intended to write. And I want to outline some of the basic pieces of the argument that I'm suggesting as a proposal. And then I want to read part of the end because I like part of the end. I thought it was pretty good. So I'm going to read part of the end, if that's cool with you. And even if it's not, only Gary can stop me, so that's where we're at. Okay, so I intended to write a very short essay. I'm on an administrative schedule at my college. I don't teach except for as an adjunct here and there. So when the semester ends, I get busier. So I was like, I can't spend a bunch of time on this. I assured my wife, I was like, I'm gonna do like 4 or 5 pages. It's just gonna be like real quick. I'm gonna start outlining some stuff, and it's gonna be okay. And 2 weeks later, 22 pages later, it was like, wait, is that a good plan? So with apologies to my former professors in the room, you know how that works. What I ended up doing was talking about 2 types of conversions. As I wanted to think about, primarily think about Ida B. Wells and how her campaign against lynching activates a sense of horror in her audiences. It pushes them towards being horrified by things. And I think that's morally important. I think it's ethically important to understand how to be horrified about the right things. Because it generates a certain sort of energy towards tasks that are important to us. I'm trying to restore that piece of our public conversation, of our understanding of what ethics can be, as well as my own disciplinary orientation. So when I think about the experience Wells had, what she was trying to do, I think she was trying to do was trigger her audiences an experience that was similar to her experience, which was a breaking up of a narrative that she had held about the reasons for lynching that she believed until her friends were lynched. And that's not often the way you may hear Wells's work characterized, right? But I think it's pretty important because her audiences are not primarily white audiences, although she does a lot of speaking to white folks in the course of her career. Throughout her entire career, Wells is focused on mobilizing the political and economic power of black people. Like, that is what she is after. And white folks can help with that, and they're adjacent to it, but they're not the focus, right? However, she does think it's useful to have allies who understand that certain things should be of concern, should motivate them, they could participate in some of the stuff that she's trying to center. So the mechanism for convincing them, for convincing the white audiences that lynching is a problem, are the same mechanisms that she used, that she experienced herself when her friends were lynched. So what I think is she's trying to generate the same sort of affective break that she experienced. She's primarily doing it for black audiences, but she wants white audiences to do it too, because it's the same lie. It's the same lie. They believe the same lie about black culpability in these instances of violence. So that's where I was heading with the paper, and I still got there. But what was important to me was to bring it into a space that was confessional and it was oriented towards my own experience with this material, my own understanding of how whiteness and race function. And so it was important for me to talk about my grandfather and my own family, because the story of Wells confronting, well, let me put it this way. Professor Cohn gave us an example last night of how he writes for, an explanation last night of how he writes for his parents. And speaks into a place where they couldn't speak, about how they used their blackness to survive, right? How they merged love and survival in this really powerful way. And the way it's defined, several threads of tradition within Christian thought and other spaces as well. So I have the opposite problem, sociologically speaking. I had to figure out how my grandfather used whiteness to survive. And I have to do it while I still love him, and while I'm still so proud of him. Right? But I had to figure out how to square this story with what I know is true and important about the world and the moral world that I want to create. I had to figure out my own body to do this work. You see. So, and what I mean is my grandfather moved from Bunch, Oklahoma to Indianapolis to Detroit. And in that process, finalized a chain of events that began with his grandparents when they met at the Haskell Institute from the Ojibwe and Cherokee tribes. It's a multi-tribal school. And they started a family. And by the time my grandfather got to Detroit, he left his Indianness behind him completely. He was neither Cherokee nor Ojibwe. I say in the essay that if you squint in Detroit, he could be Italian. So he let people squint. And one of the very important tools by which he finalized that transition to whiteness, and this is not how he would have understood it, obviously, right? It is by acquiring the habits and the dress and the speech and the respectability that qualifies you for entrance into a class and into a caste. And he learned those things in part in the Church of Christ. They let him put on a suit, let him be a deacon and an elder. He got to be in front of people, right? It helped him move from somebody who was drinking away his paycheck to somebody who was taking care of his family, right? Somebody who, the whole town came to his funeral, right? Became a beloved person and a beloved leader in that community. But part of the bargain was becoming white. Now, for me, the process of realizing this was a process of being educating myself. And the pieces of this puzzle didn't come together for me until I was in graduate school and reading the stories of immigrants' transformation to, I wasn't even reading theories of critical race theory necessarily, just reading immigrant stories. And their process of transitioning from whatever ethnicity they brought with them to becoming assimilated into this mass white culture, right? And how they negotiate their religious identities in those spaces. And realizing, as I was reading these stories of, sometimes they're also indigenous folks who are making those same choices, those same trade-offs. The autobiography of Malcolm X is pretty much a blueprint for how to deal with all these themes and issues, right? They're all living there in some way. Being able to see my grandfather's strategies for negotiating the world in those places where people were becoming white was like it was a revelation to me. And it was sort of a dreadful one. And I had people to walk me through it, right? To talk to me about it, help me understand it intellectually. And obviously I'm still dealing with the realities that calls forth for me, right? But the mechanism that I think is really important for us to start to think about is how do we get people to that place where we're able to see parts of what we're imbricated in as horrifying and be able to own that, right? And recognize the complexity of our own bodies, our own embodied existence in the context in which we actually live, which is in a vast mechanism of extraction, right? That's founded on the betrayal and swindle and exploitation of huge classes of people who are non-white. So it's the defining social organizing tool of this country. And to be here is to be a part of it. And either you're winning or you're losing because of what place you are in that system. In the paper I said you pull a lever, a little blood drains from somewhere. Okay, so how does Wells do it? Right, so forget me, like not understand. How does Ida B. Wells do this work? And what I see in her strategy for communicating with her audiences are three things I think are important. And they're among the things she does, but I think they're helpful for us to frame sort of how we get at that horror in a way that makes it comprehensible to us and able to act on it. So on the first piece I see is a litany of horrors, right? A litany of evidence, where she is laying out the case based on things that are discoverable, the case she can articulate. There's evidence you can see, there's documentation. And putting it in context is persuasive if you're able to hear and listen, right? So there are stories about her taking like lynching photographs, there's a particular one I like where she has an illustration of a lynching, and folks in the UK, some of them won't believe that it's actually, they think it's conjured up, until she shows them the photograph that it's based on. And then that person is overwhelmed by that and becomes one of the organizers of one of her clubs, right? So there's there's a responsibility to document and to make persuasive arguments based on the canons of evidence that are relevant to whatever discipline or area which we may work. So that's an important piece right there. The other piece is the human response. She assumes a human response in people. She assumes that there's some. This is just like a 19th century given, right? This is the legacy of those late Enlightenment folks and Hume and the other. Even Adam Smith actually assumes this, so who knows if it's right or not. But I.W. Wells assumes that if we expose people to the horrors, there is a part of our humanity that will respond. We will respond to suffering in some way, right? So she's telling those stories because she thinks people will trigger something in people. It's the same reason that Bartolomé de las Casas told the stories of the slaughter of in the Americas to the Spanish. But as we know from that case, if just telling the horrible stories doesn't matter on its own, right? You also have to have some sort of context for the storytelling and for the horrors, because people printed lynching photographs and distributed them as souvenirs, right? So just having a horrible picture that says that's suffering, either kind of titillate you or make you furious and horrified. We want the horrified one, right? We don't want the lurid response to it. So for Wells, the other important piece is this are these scenes of ethical instruction. I'm stealing from Mark Jordan, who's a Catholic thinker and ethicist on this. But the way that I have like 1 minute. Okay, it's going well. It's going fine. What Jordan suggests is that we don't often foreground this, but we in the history of ethics, the scenes in which ethical teachings are unfolded are really critical to how those lessons are meant to be interpreted. So whether it's Plato's dialogues or Jesus teaching disciples by the Sea of Galilee, or other spaces where ideas are exchanged, placing ourselves as characters in those spaces and finding ourselves as characters listening and engaging in those dialogues and possibly being the teachers, where we find ourselves in those scenes of ethical instructions are key for us as we read and understand new ideas and we're confronted by what it means to be good, that we need to recover those places so that we can actually hear and listen in context. And he's done great, rich work with some of the queer community in San Francisco, I believe, and unpacking some of this. But in my own, in Wells, what she does is she starts these clubs, right? And this is part of the club movement, the women's club movement, black club movement, in the 19th century and throughout the world, where she creates these spaces of people who share some moral convictions. She tries to push them towards this perception collectively, right? So it's people who share convictions, trying to get them to believe evidence together. And she's presenting the argument, she's making the case, she's counting on you to have some sort of response to it, and she wants you to be with people of some sort of similar disposition who will listen to evidence and judge fairly, and then act when you're horrified by things. So that context of moral friendships, right, of people who will love the same sort of stuff you do and be united and care about something with you, is critical. So I'm not talking about like churches, or I'm not talking about these big institutional clusters of things that have their own logic and trajectory. And I am talking about these sort of squads of moral friendships. So I don't want to go through the rest of the materials. I don't want to take up everybody else's time. I mean, I really want to take everybody else's time, but I shouldn't do that. But you're right. But we basically have a choice of how we're going to navigate the sorts of horror, sorts of intensity we generate in the groups that we're a part of. And we can either take this narrative of everyone's pain being equal, and we have to listen to everybody's story and make sure this was Obama in July 7th in Dallas after the shootings there. Basically, everybody's pain is the same. The police who walk out the door, their wives' pain is the same as the black mother who sees her son out the door, and they worry about their safety. I think it's profoundly inadequate to say that. It's profoundly inadequate. It doesn't attend to the texture, the history, the context of actual lives, or actual fear, the actual horror, right? On the other hand, when Jordan Edwards is a young man, 15 years old, who was killed by a police officer firing a rifle into a moving car in Dallas just a few weeks ago, in our area. The stories about him are typical of these stories where somebody is, we create sympathy by making them seem as innocent and as much like your family as possible. Right? It's too intimate. They don't have to be innocent to be worthy of your sympathy and care. They don't have to look like your family. They don't have to seem like your friends, right? So the space I'm suggesting we move to is this, it engages the deliberative act of choosing to be sympathetic with certain people, of making a choice about the history we find ourselves in, and where we can direct our emotional energy. And I'm asking to think about moral friendship in that way, right? Where the context that we exercise our love and our heart are in is not the one hand of the sort of bureaucratic sympathy that tries to solve problems based on who we should feel bad for. And it's not a thing that reduces everything to loyalty to people who are most innocent and most like us. It is a chosen sort of friendship that says, where you are worried for your people, I'll be worried for your people too. I will learn how to be worried for. I will be a bystander. I'll stand, the character I'll find myself in your scene is I will stand and listen to you as you work out your fear and try to understand what the world is you're trying to make and figure out how I can help make that world happen. So it decenters white listeners and asks you to engage other people, which I should do right now. So thank you.
I'll also do some combination of reading and talking through my paper as well. In a disturbing scene caught on camera by a CNN reporter in early 2016, several black protesters who had interrupted a campaign rally with the Black Lives Matter chant were forcibly removed while angry white onlookers drowned them out with shouts of "All Lives Matter." That exchange for many captures the state of racial justice in the U.S. For blacks, the phrase popularized after the 2013 Trayvon Martin case demands that society recognize the ongoing reality of injustice, whereas the retort, "All Lives Matter," even uttered with the best of intentions, glosses over a past of injustice and a present marked by persistent racist attitudes and structures. In philosopher Gordon Marino's words, prayerfully intoning "All Lives Matter" is an oblique way of muting the hard truths of Katrina, Ferguson, Waller County, Texas, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Charleston. It's a way of dismissing the special burdens that African Americans have endured in the biased, harrowing machine of American justice. That "all lives matter" is frequently uttered with indignation or even vehement anger simply underscores the dominant culture's resistance to acknowledging the legacy of white supremacy. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone offered a hopeful possibility for bridging this divide by challenging us to remember the pervasive, violent dehumanization that black Americans faced in the lynching era, and to honor their efforts to preserve their dignity as humans and their hope as people of God against that violence. But he also acknowledges our sometimes fierce resistance to such honest remembering. And yet, he insists, to forget this atrocity leaves us with a fraudulent perspective on this society and on the meaning of the Christian gospel for this nation. His warning illuminates the controversy over Black Lives Matter, seen in light of his call to truth-telling, where the cry of Black Lives Matter is a bold claim to personhood. The retort of "All Lives Matter" reflects a naive, or worse, a willful turning away from the nation's exclusion of blacks from the category all lives. At its core, The Cross and the Lynching Tree asserts that the future of race relations hinge, at least in part, on our capacity to remember truthfully. Few voices from the period Cone identifies as a lynching era confronted that resistance to truth with greater insight or force than African-American leader and statesman Frederick Douglass. He denounced the depiction of blacks in popular culture, even in the North, as ignorant and unintelligent, or worse, as, quote, moral monsters ferociously invading the sacred rights of women and endangering the homes of whites. He condemned the nation's hypocrisy in claiming to be a Christian country while tolerating Southern mobs who subjected blacks to blood-chilling horrors and then gloated over and preyed upon the dead bodies of their victims. But Douglass was especially vexed by the indifference of so-called Northern sympathizers. His counterpart to the Christians, Cone indicts for failing to oppose slavery, segregation, and lynching as a contradiction of the gospel for America. Their unacknowledged prejudice caused them to turn a blind eye to black suffering in the post-war South, effectively saying to the lynchers and mobocrats of the South, "Go on in your hellish work of Negro persecution. You kill their bodies, we kill their souls. And so in my paper, I use Professor Cohn's work as a point of departure for examining Frederick Douglass's John Brown address of May the 30th, 1881, given at Storer College, one of the nation's first historically black colleges in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, just blocks from Brown's famous or infamous raid of 1859. The speech is a commemorative address, a speech of praise, and commemorative addresses are exercises in public memory. And so in my paper, I focus on the way that Douglass exploits and then challenges common ways of remembering John Brown and John Brown's raid, and then the way that he takes his audience into a powerful remembering of slavery itself. So in a commemorative address, there are certain things that you do. You talk about the person being memorialized, you tell that person's story, you talk about his or her character traits and accomplishments and legacy, and often there will be something negative about that person, and so if you can ignore it, you do, but if you can't ignore the negative, you mention it and downplay it as best you can. Well, for this speech, the big obstacle for commemorating John Brown, of course, is John Brown's raid. For Southerners, it had brought ferocious condemnation, but even in the North, it was viewed with ambivalence at best. Many condemned it, and even abolitionists, while lauding Brown's passion and singing of Brown, still denounced the raid's violence. And my argument is that Douglass used the generic form, but instead of downplaying the raid, he actually makes it the centerpiece. And he uses that generic form as a vehicle for incisively critiquing the dominant culture's blindness to its own racism. I divide the analysis into two parts. Both have to do with provoking his hearers to see realities to which they had been blind. Part of what I find compelling about Professor Cohn's work is just that sense of the transformative power of seeing. And that is a theme that runs through this speech particularly. And so first, Douglass wants his audience to see their own unacknowledged racism, and then he wants them to see the suffering of their black fellow citizens, all turning on their capacity to remember. So the first part, I've called Exposing Blindness, Ironic Reversal, and Self-Knowledge. And so here I focus on the way that Douglass used irony, or ironic reversal, to challenge his hearers to see their own racism. And there are a couple of instances in the speech where he does that. I'll just talk about one. Early in the speech, he does what we would expect in a commemorative address, given the notorious nature of the raid. He narrates the raid in a really clipped and clinical fashion, as if he's going to acknowledge it and then move on. But instead, he does the opposite. He returns to it and narrates it a second time, and the second time in a way that seems intended to magnify its most ruthless and criminal aspects. He calls to mind the popularly held conception or vision of the town's residents. Here's Douglass. They had retired as usual to rest, with no suspicion that an enemy lurked in the surrounding darkness. They had quietly and trustingly given themselves up to tired nature's sweet restorer, balmy sleep. And while thus all unconscious of danger, they were roused from their peaceful slumbers by the sharp crack of the invader's rifle and felt the keen-edged sword of war at their throats, 3 of their number already slain. It's like he's deliberately arousing emotions of shock and anger. And then he goes on to praise them for feeling the outrage that he's just evoked. He says, he calls it a holy feeling. We are indebted to this tender sentiment of regard for human life, for the safety with which we walk the streets by day and sleep secure in our beds at night. Boy, there's some irony, huh? And so instead of dismissing the raid, he actually tells the raid twice, and then the second time really intending to provoke outrage among his hearers. Well, to what end? We find out in the passage that immediately follows, where he evokes the familiar biblical imagery of sowing and reaping to turn the outrage he's just aroused back on his audience. The bloody harvest of Harper's Ferry was ripened by the heat and moisture of merciless bondage of more than 200 years. The startling cry of alarm on the banks of the Potomac was but the answering back of the avenging angel to the midnight invasions of Christian slave traders on the sleeping hamlets of Africa. The history of the African slave trade furnishes many illustrations far more cruel and bloody. And here's the reversal on which irony as a rhetorical form turns. He brings before the eyes of his listeners this image of an enemy lurking in the darkness, suddenly putting the sword to the throats of defenseless, innocent victims sleeping in their beds, and they're outraged at hearing that. And then he suddenly applies that same imagery to the experience of Africans violently stolen from their beds and forced into cruel enslavement against their wills. And the effect, at least potentially, is a punch in the gut. It is the realization that his hearers could feel such strong emotion in the face of Brown's attack on the slaveholding citizens of Harper's Ferry, while feeling nothing in response to the far greater outrage of slavery itself. That was the true outrage. And Douglas's hope, I think, is to provoke that sudden flash of self-awareness and perhaps shame at seeing the truth about themselves. It's been said that humility is the proper partner of irony. And it would be hard to hear this and not feel silenced and chastened. And then thus chastened, they're prepared for what comes next. And that brings me to the second part of my analysis, offering sight, narrative depiction, and moral conviction. In the second part of his speech, Douglas talks in greater detail about Brown's life, his character, and he emphasizes one central quality in Brown's life, and that was his ability to see. His ability to see through no mist or haze, but in the light of infinite brightness, which left none of its 10,000 horrors out of sight. So unlike his audience, who were blind to their own racism as well as to the horrors of slavery, Brown could see. And then Douglas tells where Brown got that clarity of vision, and it was from a formative incident that happened in his boyhood. And again, we're seeing the power of memory here. Here's what Douglas says. Brown, had for some reason been sent to the state of Kentucky, where he made the acquaintance of a slave boy about his own age, of whom he became very fond. For some petty offense, this boy was one day subjected to a brutal beating. The blows were dealt with an iron shovel and fell fast and furiously upon his slender body. Brown, he said, had been born in a free state and so was unaccustomed to such scenes of cruelty. His pure and sensitive soul, you think about the image that we typically have of John Brown. It's kind of the crazed maniac look. And so part of what Douglas is doing is taking us to a vision of Brown as an innocent child. So he's a pure and innocent soul, revolted at the shocking spectacle of that early, and at that early age swore eternal hatred to slavery. Even the passing of years, he said, had not obliterated the image, so that as with Moses, who had similarly witnessed the beating of a Hebrew bondsman by an Egyptian, Brown's encounter with this outrage on a helpless slave boy in our own land may have caused, 40 years afterward, a John Brown and a Harper's Ferry raid. In my analysis, I use Paul Ricoeur's conception of the threefold mimesis involved in an audience's encounter with narrative. So mimesis 1 is the reader's pre-understanding of the world, the imagination of the world they bring to their encounter with story. Mimesis 2 is the representation offered in the poetic work itself. All those elements in plot and character that, in Ricoeur's words, open up the kingdom of as if. And then mimesis 3 is the new representation of the world that grows out of the intersection of the world of the text and the world of the hearer. And I argue that in this brief episode, as Douglas frames it, it mimics that threefold process in a way that guides the audience's hearing of the story. Brown brings to the experience a prefigured imagination of the world that is naively oblivious to the life of this child he simply takes for a friend. He's ignorant of the dramatic gulf that yawns between their life circumstances. But then he is wrenched into witnessing his young playmate viciously beaten by the white master. Brown returns to the world with a newfound hatred for slavery and an argument against contempt for small things. Brown's experience provided a paradigmatic path for comprehension that Douglas hoped his own listeners would follow. Like Brown, their prefigured representation of the world was naive to the realities of slavery, blind even to their own biases against blacks. But then, like Brown, they were drawn into mimesis 2, entering the world of the story so vividly recounted by Douglas, where they witnessed the iron shovel coming down repeatedly on the slender body of a helpless child. The story challenged his hearers to continue following the narrative's flow, returning to the world as Brown did with a new conviction of mimesis 3. It provided an appropriate focus for the emotions Douglass had earlier aroused and then condemned in response to the outrage suffered by the slaveholding citizens of Harper's Ferry. Symbolically transferring those emotions to blacks who were the true victims of the nation's crime. Thus, this brief episode seems deliberately crafted to take Douglass's hearers into a transformative experience of remembering, modeled after Brown's, where they are shaken from their naivete and ignorance. Just as Brown came away with a lifelong hatred of racism and injustice, Douglass' audience, drawn in and confronted by a spectacle from which they might otherwise have turned away, could now return to their world with new vision and conviction. In my conclusion, I talk about Douglass's skill and sophistication as a rhetor, and I talk about the utility of certain rhetorical forms, of course, irony and narrative principle among them, but I just want to read a reflection to end on what I find most remarkable, and that is the underlying hopefulness in Frederick Douglass, and that is so compelling to me in the work of Professor Cohn. In both, we see an indomitable optimism that holds out the possibility that our society still has a conscience, susceptible to being pricked by images of black suffering and injustice. Frederick Douglass offers a model of prophetic engagement with the dominant culture, a model with which I believe Professor Cohn and Black Lives Matter share significant continuity. Certainly, Douglass's irony was severe and penetrating, leaving its victims humbled by the stinging rebuke of a black man. Yet that irony drew upon a set of values he shared with his white audiences, centered on the regard for human life, which transcended their differences. It was only because he believed his hearers truly held those ideals that he could rebuke whites for failing to live up to them. The Black Lives Matter movement stands within that same tradition of prophetic engagement. Rather than rejecting the dominant culture and the possibility of racial healing, the movement employs its own form of irony to engage the culture by paradoxically declaring as a fact what should be so obvious as to go without saying. That declaration invites a stance of humility at the dominant culture's need to be informed of what they should already know. And I think the retort of all lives matter is in large part a defensive reaction to that. And yet underlying that rebuke is an assumption held in common between the movement and the dominant culture about the value of human life. Cornel West, in his own penetrating analysis of race in America, asserted that the ultimate threat to black America was not oppression or exploitation, but nihilism, which grows out of blacks' lived experiences with horrifying meaninglessness, hopelessness, and lovelessness. The frightening response to such conditions is a numbing detachment from others and a self-destructive disposition toward the world. To succumb to that impulse, West believed, would be disastrous. In the face of that existential threat, Professor Cohn stands squarely in the tradition of Frederick Douglass as one who knows deeply the impact of white supremacy and who unrelentingly uncovers and condemns racism, especially among the nation's citizens who claim to be Christian. And yet he also recognizes that the reality that the history of blacks and whites in America is inextricably linked, and that the ideals and values of the nation and of our faith hold out the possibility for living together in a just society. From that vantage point, he is able to condemn racial justice without succumbing to nihilistic hopelessness. Cohn's work, as painful as it is to read, thus conveys the optimism that is so striking in the rhetoric of Frederick Douglass, a conviction that facing the truth of our past might open the door to true reconciliation. If we could only see racial injustice as it is, if we could simply be present with our defenses lowered to an unclouded glimpse of its full cruelty, then like John Brown, we would be possessed of the same abhorrence toward oppression that drove him to give his life to liberate the slaves of Harper's Ferry. May God grant that this optimism is not unfounded.
In the spirit of my ancestors, from an African perspective, I will choose to sit to be a part of the community and not to seek authority by standing above it. Just thought throw that out there. And your native ancestors would think the same. So when I was asked to present on this panel, at first I was like, well, what in the world am I going to talk about that I haven't already talked about almost ad nauseum? But it reminded me of when my children were younger and they had their favorite bedtime stories. My daughter loved the book, I Love My Hair. And my son loved the book, The Big Box by Toni Morrison, and anything with Anansi the Spider. And he's very tricky to this day because of those bedtime stories. But I read them to them over and over and over again. And for those of you who know my children, you know that one thing about them is they're extremely confident in who they are. And so I said, well, I will tell the same story and read what you guys know me to read and to write about. And so I'm going to tell what I call the Church of Christ story in this paper called Out of Darkness, Church Memory in Black and White. So we in the Church of Christ believe that we are a body of believers that are reflected in the New Testament church that was established on the day of Pentecost. That's our story. If this premise is true, there are some lessons from the New Testament church to which we should probably pay some attention. The early church's struggles with race relations should inform our contemporary issues of race relations in the church today. The first century church had an ethnically diverse, multicultural membership. According to Acts chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, there were Jews from every nation in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. After hearing Peter preach about Jesus, about 3,000 were baptized that day. Acts 2, 42, 47 tells us that these new converts devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. These Jews from every nation made a conscious decision to follow the teachings of Jesus together. However, they continued to struggle with their diversity. We see examples of this in Acts 6 with the struggle between the Greek widows and the Hebrews, and that the Greek believers accused that the Hebrew believers were overlooking the Greek widows in the daily distribution of food. As a result, 7 men were chosen by the fellowship to oversee this process. The early church leaders recognized this cultural conflict and sought a spiritual resolution. However, the early church leaders did not always handle the cultural conflict in this way. Sometimes they didn't get it right, and they probably didn't get it right more often than they did. But there's one story in particular in Galatians 2, where Paul provides a glimpse of the struggle of a multicultural fellowship. In verses 11 through 13, Paul describes the confrontation that he had with Peter. I opposed to him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, Peter began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. So despite being a leader among the followers of Jesus, Peter still struggled with social and cultural traditions. It was difficult for him to resist the tradition of exclusion, characteristic of the narrative around fellowshipping with the uncircumcised. This incident demonstrates the stronghold that tradition often holds on us. Peter's hypocritical behavior influenced other leaders around him. Barnabas, who had a reputation for being an encourager, was even influenced to support Peter's hypocrisy for the sake of tradition. The early church struggled with multicultural fellowships. However, their response was not to separate or uphold those social and cultural traditions. They relied on their quest to follow the teachings of Jesus to keep them in fellowship. Contemporary churches of Christ in America are rooted in the Restoration movement of the early 1800s, which is called the Stone Campbell movement. This movement was an attempt to return to the church of the New Testament in its governance, doctrine, and worship style. The Restoration movement was intended to be a movement that unites all Christians, but evolved to a movement characterized by separation and division. Leroy Garrett tells us that there are three main branches of this movement: the Christian church, the disciples of Christ, and the churches of Christ. Within the churches of Christ, there are 6 identified divisions. The first one, mainline. Second, non-cooperatives. The third one, one-cuppers, which was an experience for me yesterday, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. The fourth one, pre-millennials. The fifth one, non-Sunday school churches of Christ. And the sixth group, Black churches of Christ. The idea that one division of churches of Christ is identified as Black churches of Christ indicates that there is a serious issue with racial division among this fellowship. This division is most pronounced when the churches of Christ is placed within the context of American history. One of the most pronounced nadirs of American history is the institution of chattel slavery. Members of the churches of Christ, particularly in slaveholding states, supported the institution of slavery and were often slaveholders. The following account provides a glimpse of the relationship between the slaveholder and the enslaved within the context of an early congregation. And it reads, "In those early days, slaves drove their masters to the services. Others living near came and stood on the outside, while several went in to assist with the children or to do any other kind of work assigned. Some of the slaves, being deeply impressed, sought spiritual guidance. They were already in Hades, and to hear a man of God tell them how they might secure peace and sit down at the welcome table pleased them very much. They did not choose to go to a torment greater than the one already experienced. It had been hard to understand the preaching, but now this simple way of telling the old story appealed to most of them. Several were added to the church. Often, these went back and told the news to the other slaves. Many believed and were baptized. Others were taught by the masters and their families. At times, the most gifted among the slaves were trained and allowed to preach to the rest. Occasionally, slaves were gathered in separate buildings and were preached to by the evangelists either before or after the regular service." That's an important blueprint. Many in the early American church did not see a conflict between their desire to follow Jesus' teaching, the growth of the church, and the institution of slavery. Slaveholders often planted churches for the enslaved, an important blueprint. It was not uncommon to hear the myths of the curse of Ham and the curse of Cain preached from the pulpit to justify slavery as part of God's plan and desire. These myths have lasting effects on contemporary race relations in the church. The institution of chattel slavery was later replaced with a system of apartheid, commonly referred to as the era of Jim Crow. Many leaders of the Churches of Christ fought diligently to justify and maintain the system. God and the Bible were often employed as instruments of social control and social alienation. For instance, Alexander Bigby Lipscomb, nephew of David Lipscomb, provided interesting insight into the remarkable success of Marshall Campbell, who is known as one of our most successful evangelists among churches of Christ, specifically among Black churches of Christ. Lipscomb observed after a campaign led by Campbell in Valdosta, Georgia, that resulted in more than 329 baptisms of both blacks and whites. This is what Lipscomb said: "Such preaching has not only created a new religious and moral status for the Negro element, but it has brought to this community a new citizenry capable of thinking in terms of the Bible. This means that we now have better farmhands, better porters, better cooks, better housemaids than ever before. It's clear from Lipscomb's assessment that the value of conversion and planting churches for the formerly enslaved is to create a better quality class of servants. Lipscomb goes on to suggest that this method should be replicated in countless other home fields where the Negroes flourish and need to be taught. Lipscomb ends this plea to his readers with the following. Is it not fitting that the descendants of the race whom our fathers kept in the bondage of human slavery, but to whom civilization brought the gift of emancipation, should now be led by the white children of the present generation out of the darkness and bondage of sin into the glorious liberty of the children of God? While Lipscomb saw the work of Campbell as remarkable, he never considered Campbell or any other African American as his equal. He saw it as the duty of the white children of the present generation to lead these descendants of the race whom his fathers kept in the bondage of human slavery to salvation. Unfortunately, Lipscomb's comments were not uncommon among leaders in the churches of Christ. And I would argue that's still the case. This nation continued to struggle with an ever-changing society where descendants of the enslaved applied increasing pressure for civil rights. Many leaders of the churches of Christ resisted this pressure. At the 1963 lectureship held at the Florida Christian College, Franklin Puckett, a Church of Christ preacher of Dyersburg, Tennessee, delivered a lecture entitled The Messiah and Racial Problems. Puckett admits to approaching the subject of race relations with fear and trembling. He says the following: so many people have fixed opinions on the race question and deliberately close their minds and hearts to any delineation of facts or presentation of arguments which do not harmonize with those opinions. Emotionalism often shuts out realism, and sectional bias frequently closes the door on factual truth. Because of this factor, it is easy for one to be misunderstood. For these reasons, I have written out what I want to say on this subject so that I, at least, will know what I have said. Exactly. Siri is right. She's right. So, Siri said, what? Puckett is laying the foundation for his view of race relations by assuring his audience that his argument is based on factual truth. So he goes on to say, notwithstanding the equality of the relation and service in the spiritual realm, there is another principle revealed in the teaching of the Messiah that must be recognized and respected. The practice of righteousness does not require, as some have erroneously concluded, the abolition of social and political distinctions in the civil realm. There have always been and always will be social distinctions in the civil realm which do not exist in the spiritual, nor is their existence out of harmony with New Testament Christianity, his truth. A failure to recognize this truth is responsible for much of the confusion relative to racial problems. Let each remain in his own state without being concerned over external matters, but rather concern himself with the doing of God's will. Let every man abide in the calling wherein he was called. If both the whites and the blacks would practice this instruction, they would be unconcerned about the color of their skin or the changing of the external customs stemming therefrom. Instead, they would be devoted to the practice of the will of God within their respective spheres. Puckett compares the social and political distinctions in the civil realm to marital and parenting relationships, in that they are agreed upon roles that exist because that is the way that God intended. He suggests that Christians should not be concerned with social injustices like Jim Crow policies of that era, but they should be concerned with God's will, as if these are competing concerns. These sentiments are not atypical of those of Southern white preachers in the churches of Christ during this era. In a 1954 essay entitled Segregation or Christianity, Brian Vinson, a well-respected preacher in the churches of Christ, laments of the notion that segregation and Christianity cannot coexist. Sorry. As was posited by a fellow Christian in another Church of Christ supported newspaper. The essay was published 5 months after the landmark ruling, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which declared that segregation of public schools were unconstitutional. Vinson expresses his views of desegregation of public schools in general and desegregation of private Christian schools specifically. He writes, first, Christianity is dependent for its current and practical existence among us on 2 external influences. First, the decision of the Supreme Court recently holding segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. Just think of the 5 previous decisions to the contrary, which obstructed the inauguration and practice of the whole principle of Christianity. Christianity is here made to depend on the point of constitutionality as established by a political court rather than on scripturality as established by the Word of God. Amazing in its absurdity. This is what he said. Second, with respect to admission of Negroes into Christian schools, it is pointed out that we have the very splendid example of denominational institutions bravely doing this even before the recent decision of the court. Hence, we gain support from this source as an example worthy to follow. It has been long my persuasion that when brethren make appeals in behalf of anything and are given to citing denominational procedure as precedents for such, that the proposal merits suspicion. He goes on to compare the equality of races with the equality of gender in the following passages. One could conclude that since, as many of you have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus, that no distinction or segregation of the sexes can be practiced. Hence, if the equality pleaded for in this editorial be founded on this passage and involves the mixing of the Negro with the whites in dormitories, it would also require the mixing of males and females, or else there would be discrimination. This passage has nothing to do with social equality, but simply teaches that which all recognize as true, namely that all men need salvation, and God has one plan to save all. So he attempts to use the scripture to support his segregationist views. Vincent has made the distinction between equality in Christ and social equality among the races. He takes his discussion even further to reflect the attitudes of many white Southerners of the era when he writes the following. The question before us in this hour is not segregation nor Christianity, but rather it is segregation or miscegenation. Within a few generations of non-segregation, there shall be inevitably a widespread mixing and mongrelization of the 2 races by intermarriage. Place the 2 races together on every plane of social intercourse in the schools, the churches, the parks, the swimming pools, and the social parlor, and these developments shall follow. In the same vein, I think we should remain unaffected by what the denominations are doing about segregation and strive to promote and safeguard the interests of both races by maintaining that separateness is best for all. While it is true that what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, equally true in principle is it that what God has separated, let no man put together. So these kinds of sermons and ideas have been perpetuated throughout our fellowship, through our systems that we have in place. We have our lectureships, we have our conferences, we have our workshops, we have our journals, we have our newspapers, and we can see throughout our history here in the U.S. that this same kind of ideology has been perpetuated. What do we see today? We see the same ideology being perpetuated. We have just changed the way in which we say it. We don't talk about miscegenation in the way that we talk about it. We don't talk about segregation and desegregation. But we talk about it in the context of social policies. We ensure, when we look around and we ask, why, when I look at the congregations I'm in, why are they white or why are they black? When I look at the schools that my children attend, why are they white? Why are they black? When I look at our Christian colleges, Why are they white? We have one black with 42 students. Okay. So there are things that we have, that we see as evidence today, that continues to demonstrate that we live within this. So this is our foundation. And we all know that whatever foundation a house is built on, you can paint the house whatever color, you can change up the windows, you can put in a new HVAC system, you could put in a big screen TV, you could do all kinds of things, but the foundation is still the same. So it's important for us in this context that we continue to tell the story of who we truly are, so that we can start dismantling that foundation and start rebuilding a foundation that is true to who we say that we truly are. Thank you.
Pleased to be here today and to have this opportunity to respond to this panel entitled Race, Reconciliation, and Public Memory. I truly enjoyed reading all three papers. Excellently written and scholarly, and deeply penetrated on race, reconciliation, and memory. And I would say that if Christian churches and the American people had wrestled with race as reflected in these papers, we would not be faced with a deeply divided church, so well stated by Dr. Bryce. And we would not be faced with a deeply divided nation as we are faced with today. Dr. Tanya Bryce makes clear that the churches of Christ, like other U.S. churches, are divided by race. And most leaders, with few exceptions, saw no conflict between racial segregation, white supremacy, and the Christian gospel. And it's amazing, as we've heard, which she's articulated, it's amazing how Christian scholars and preachers are so blind to the truth of the gospel. Now, Gary Selby writes, Cone stands squarely in the tradition of Frederick Douglass. And he's right. I do stand in that tradition, and in the tradition of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ella Baker. We all know the impact of white supremacy. And no one articulated the evil of white supremacy like Ida B. Wells, who is the subject of Christopher Dowdy's paper, and who teaches at a historically black college like the ones I attended, which is AME. I know the challenges he faced as he articulated in his paper, trying to understand an experience that places him as the enemy of the students he's trying to teach. You think about that. As Gary Selby says, I do recognize that the history of blacks and whites in America is inextricably linked, and that the ideas and value of the nation and of our faith hold out the possibility of living together in a just society. This belief enables me, as he says, to condemn racial injustice without succumbing to nihilistic hopelessness. He's correct about that. Then he says, and I'm quoting, Cone's work conveys the optimism that is so remarkable in Frederick Douglass. Now, here is where I might have a theological disagreement with him. Optimism is not a term I would use to describe my theological imagination. I prefer the term hope, not optimism. Optimism is too superficial, too easy, too secular. There is nothing in American history that makes me optimistic. But there is a lot that makes me hopeful. Optimism is not biblical. It's not a biblical term, but hope is. I can't preach on optimism. I just can't do it. But I can preach on hope. Yeah. Even in the face of death. And I can do that because of the one who gave his life as a ransom for many. There is no optimism really in King's vision of the beloved community. But there is hope. There is no optimism behind my work. But there is hope. For me, there is a very important distinction, and I think he probably believes that too, between optimism and hope. Now, Frederick Douglass probably did believe in optimism. He probably did, and the reason is because his belief was not deeply rooted in the black religious experience. But his belief was rooted in the American experience. His optimism was in the possibility of America, especially white America. He really did believe that. I am not optimistic about white America, but I'm hopeful about it. Hope resides in God and in the people who reside at the bottom of the American experience. That's the conflict. That's the contradiction. So, you don't get to hope too easy. Hope stares you in the face. That's how can you see hope in the crucifixion? You think about that. And I think if you get to if you get to optimism and too quick, you get to that. I don't see optimism in the crucifixion. I do see hope. Yes. And I think if whites talk too much about optimism, they won't really face what they got to do. That you notice that no mention has been made of reparations? That's the thing. And until you start talking about that, all you got is optimism. You just don't want black people not to just forget. We ain't gonna forget. We're not gonna forget. You may not do nothing, but we ain't gonna forget, and we ain't gonna stop hoping because it doesn't depend on you. It's deeper than that. Because if we didn't hope in the last 400 years, we wouldn't be here. If our ancestors could face slavery for 246 years, we can face Donald Trump. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we can. Yeah. Because there is something. There is something in this black religious experience that you can't kill. You can't destroy. And when I wrote The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that's what I was dealing with. That's why the first chapter is the trouble nobody knows. The trouble I see. Yeah, that's where we start. But what I like about these papers is they face the problem of race and memory and reconciliation. They faced it head on. And I still think if you keep talking like that and act on it, there is hope for you and for all of us. Because I don't think there is any hope unless we all work together. And you know, it's hard. It's hard. But I want to thank you for letting me be a part of this discussion. Because this is what it's all about. When you get honest talking, straight talking, then you can move ahead. Thank you very much.
5 years old, and it's the same as when I was 5.
Yeah.
And I think what you are talking about how important it is that we remember that that's the way it was, and that's the way it still is.
Mm-hmm.
That is where I think people who come from the perspective that I was given at birth, that's where we have to understand. And that is something that you have so vividly given me, is how important it is that we remember.
Yeah.
That's how it was, and that's how it still is.
Yeah.
So I just want to say
Thank you.
You know, it's real interesting. I love what you said.
Yeah.
It's an important piece. Because as we talk about the narrative that we give our children is very important, right? Because we begin believing that. So it's interesting that a church plant that is based on white supremacist ideology, to plant a black church to maintain the sense of servitude, then the narrative gets flipped that it's so that they will be comfortable.
Yeah.
When it is actually about the white folks feeling comfortable. And so that's our story though. I grew up in in black churches of Christ. I'm third generation. My grandfather was a black church planter. So I did not know any different. I thought our churches were separated because y'all don't know how to sing and we do. That's what I'm honest. I thought it was because y'all was kind of dead and some of our churches allowed us to clap. Some of us, few of them. So I thought it was about the worship style until I started learning truth and realizing that our churches were planted the way they were planted intentionally, which does make us a little different than our traditional black churches, other denominations where black folks on their own, because of racism, created their own institutions, FUBU, right, for us, by us. But Churches of Christ is a different story. Our churches were planted to maintain servitude. It's an important distinction. Oh, wait, there was one over there then. Okay, Norma, and then Norma, yeah.
Chris, I enjoyed your story about your grandfather, but the question that I have is, what were some of the consequences of his passing that might have impacted your family or your community? I mean, did you discover any of them at all?
If by consequences, what do you mean by consequences?
Okay, when black people passed, there were reasons in the community that they did that. Everybody knew them, they knew who they were, and they knew who they were. So was it the same sort of principles that surrounded your grandfathers doing the same thing?
Well, I put it this way. So my grandfather's named Herbert, after Herbert Hoover. But so the process was already underway when he was born, and his experience in Detroit, I think he joined a church with my grandmother's sisters and my great uncles. That was like a little Arkansas transplant church, and they had a street in I think it was on 4th Street, where they lived all the uncles and cousins all together in a little Church of Christ ghetto in a Polish Catholic neighborhood. And so what it afforded him was the stability of those family connections, and that, like, to become fully part of that extended family, and the transplant network from Arkansas. They all went back to Arkansas when they retired. So he became part of that little expatriate community, and it gave them a connection to those people. So what he did lose was any connection to the land back in Bunch, and there's a whole history there that I know parts of, and don't. But the folks who came up for now during the 50s and 60s, large groups of, like, this is during the allotment and termination period for American Indians. So while basically tribal lands are being broken up and the tribes being driven to the cities in large numbers. So there were communities of people moving to of Cherokee, moving to the city to where we had no connection to. Not at all. So even though, like, you know, phenotypically, like broad cheeks and big nose, you know, they called him, well, he and his brother's a Golden Gloves boxing champion. They were both in the Navy together, and he would get in fights with guys who called him Chief, you know. And you know, a couple times high school, when my mom was in, he died when my mom was 16, so I never met him. But, a couple times when my mom was in high school, some boy would, just because my mom looks more native than I do, and would they'd call her squaw or whatever, and that did not end well for those gentlemen. You know? So, but I mean, those are it's essentially like the residual phenotypical thing that they dealt with. But again, like, you know, my mom could also look Italian, so so they navigated those things I think in ways that I don't have a lot of access to. But does that answer the?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Bryce. I'm with the Episcopal Church and am interested in our stories. And I have so many questions, but I think the one that you could probably answer best for me is what are the best sources of your research? I mean, are you researching in the archives of the church? Are you getting oral histories? I mean, all of the above? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so one source is in the room, Dr. Doug Foster, who has spent his career documenting Church of Christ history. So that's kind of where I started to kind of figure out where we were, because the big shock to me was the whole, and Doug will tell you, he was there when I had this epiphany when I got to Abilene Christian University. The biggest shock to me initially, to my system, was that we were not the only church, and that we were not the only people going to heaven. And the whole AD 33 Day of Pentecost story. But that story is an important story for black folks, because that's how our churches were planted. To tell, it was based on that premise. That's the premise. That's the only thing that's important to us in our churches. And so I started reading Doug's work and Richard Hughes and other folks' work around Churches of Christ, just to kind of get a sense of what this American context is. And then I began looking at archival data. I'm a social welfare, my background is social work, but I do social welfare history. So I write historical context because I'm very interested in how policy impacts contemporary situations. So when we see a situation, why is it that way? There's always a paper trail. And so that's just kind of how I think, as in context. So I just started using those historiographic and archival tools to find this information. And the beauty about Church of Christ is that there's a whole lot of written stuff. In fact, right now for us and for Church of Christ research, on Abilene Christian University's website, there's a nice depository of Church of Christ history, particularly race relations, because we believed in writing a lot. So I have to tell black folks, don't let that myth that if you want to hide it from a black person, you put it in a book. I was like, don't make that true. Go and read the stuff yourself. Don't take my word for it. Read it yourself. So whenever you read anything that I've written around this, you're going to have lots and lots of references to go back and look at it. And the same way with the Episcopal Church, there's lots of information about the Episcopal Church.
Two experiences. Thanks so much for your papers. It's great all the way around. Your response is just so moving. Several years ago, I was in a group at ITC in Atlanta. There was a panel of black scholars from various black denominational groups. I don't remember the exact topic, quite frankly, but this was a number of years ago, and I was just taken aback because there was a call by almost every black theologian on that panel, a very passionate plea for the resegregation of America. And I thought, this is, I can't understand this. What they were saying was, white liberals thought that desegregation was going to solve the problems, and what the social and cultural implications by unaware white liberals, the implications, the things that happen, the consequences of this sometimes were disastrous. Second thing, I have a close friend who is a white theologian at a Northern university. We were working together with a group of people over the last 2 years on issues of mass incarceration. This was for the Faith and Order Commission of the National Council of Churches. And I did a study on the backgrounds to it on white supremacy. And this is very clear that the white church created and perpetuates the ideology of white supremacy. One day he got up and left when I was presenting my paper, and he came back, he's a close friend, and said, I just couldn't sit there and listen to it, because it was just the litany of every era in American history of how Christians reshaped the ideology in different historical periods. He said, I live now in a black neighborhood. I go to a black church. I tried that. I tried living in a white neighborhood, and I got tired of going home every day and people looking at me like, what are you doing here? And I tried going to a white, predominantly white church, and I got tired of being constantly, either the token that gets the attention or marginalized and completely forgotten. Now, that makes that explanation that you gave about Lubbock for whites who don't understand what's going on and the insidious and real and powerful nature of white supremacist theology, makes that explanation plausible. Well, they would prefer, right? They would prefer to be over there. They don't understand that it's the reality that was in that book, Divided by Faith, several years ago. When the authors interviewed all those people in religious sociology book, all of the white people that they talked to, Christians, said, oh no, white people can come to our church. We want them. Nobody ever considered, no white person ever considered becoming part of a predominantly black church, ever, in any of them. And the context that I saw, yeah, you can come if you want to be like a white person. We're not going to honor your history, your heritage, your culture, the things that you hold dear. So the masks have to remain on. And it really is, I was so moved by what you said, Dr. Cohn, because optimism is just absolutely void. After 2 years of that study, I went into a 6-month depression. The hope has to be there. It's the only thing.
Time for one more question.
Yes, just real quickly, a couple of years ago I was doing a storytelling project in Israel and Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa about reconciliation. And I asked a Palestinian woman if she'd be willing to talk to me about the status of what she believed about reconciliation in the context of Israel and Palestine. And she said, this is an inappropriate conversation. We're being occupied, so we should talk about justice and not reconciliation. So I was wondering, Dr. Cohn, if you could speak, I know we have very little time, about the relationship that you see between reconciliation and justice. And what tension they have with each other.
Yeah, that's a very important point. That's why I mentioned reparations.
Yes, sir.
See, in all those settings that you mentioned, it's justice is the first thing. You can't get genuine reconciliation without justice. And that's especially true when you're dealing with a majority group, like in this country. You know, white people have the power, whether it's in their churches, in their schools, in the nation, they have it. And so to talk about reconciliation, I understand that Palestinian woman. I understand her fully. Because you can't get reconciliation without justice and without reparations. See, and that's what people don't want to deal with, and they can't. So it's left up to the victim to figure it out. That's why, you know, we don't want to be around white people too much. They got too much power. Some of us need to be around to spy on them. You know, the spy. You know, I spy on them. I'm at Union. That's what I'm spying. But I'm not being deceived that you got justice at Union Seminary. You don't. And I tell them that. So, yes, but what I like about the papers is the good start. And what I like about this conference and this kind of setting, it's a good start. At least you're talking